My grandmother's nurse convinced everyone she had dementia so he could marry her and steal everything. But he didn't know I was still visiting her in secret. I was 17 when Roger called the family meeting. My parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, and I'd been living with my grandmother ever since. She was sharp, witty, always helping me with college applications. Roger was her nurse. He'd been around for about a year, helping with her medications and checkups. That morning, he sat me down with a lawyer present and announced my grandmother had been diagnosed with rapidly progressing dementia. She'd been moved to a memory care facility for her safety. Then he dropped the real bomb. He and my grandmother had gotten married 2 weeks ago. He was now her legal guardian with full power of attorney. When I asked to see her immediately, Roger smiled that smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let's give her time to adjust to her new environment. He added I could only visit with supervision. Something felt very wrong. Within days, Roger started selling grandmother's things. Her antique desk vanished first, then her jewelry, her paintings, facility costs, he'd say with that empty smile. But my grandmother was wealthy. She'd never needed to sell anything. Then he began opening my mail. My college acceptance letters sat on the counter, already unsealed. I control your college fund now, he mentioned over dinner. We'll discuss whether higher education is really the right path for you. The way he said we made my stomach turn. I couldn't accept it. During lunch, I took the bus to the facility and snuck past the front desk. Grandmother sat by the window staring blankly, but when she saw me, something flickered in her eyes. Trinity? She said, confused at first, then clearer. Trinity, sweetheart, what day is it? For 5 minutes, she was herself again, asking about school, my college plans, laughing at a joke I made. Then the fog rolled back in. It didn't make sense. Dementia didn't work like that. Around this time, Roger's brother Trevor started appearing at the house. He'd lean in doorways while I did homework, watching. You're really growing up, aren't you? He'd say, filling out nicely. The way his eyes traveled over me made my skin crawl. I went back the next week. Grandmother gripped my hand during another lucid moment, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. Something's wrong with me, Trinity. I don't feel right. Roger gives me my pills every day. Before I could ask what she meant, a nurse appeared and said visiting hours were over. That night, getting water, I heard Roger on the phone in his study. He was laughing. It's working perfectly. She's losing her mind more every day. The old bat won't last much longer. I froze in the hallway, ice spreading through my chest. When I visited a third time, Roger suddenly appeared in the doorway while I held grandmother's hand. His face went dark. He yanked me into the hallway and told the staff to add me to the restricted list. That night at home, he cornered me in the kitchen. Trevor leaned against the counter, blocking the exit. Your grandmother is very sick, Roger said, stepping closer. His hand clamped down on my shoulder hard enough to bruise. These visits are upsetting her. You need to accept reality and stop being selfish. Do you understand me? I nodded. But I understood something else entirely. The next morning, I called grandmother's old doctor from the school library. My voice shook as I explained everything. The sudden diagnosis, the marriage, Roger's behavior, grandmother's moments of clarity. There was a long pause. Trinity, he said gently. Roger called me last week. He's very concerned about you. He says you're having trouble accepting your grandmother's condition. My throat tightened. That's not... I understand this is hard. Denial is a normal part of grief. I hung up and called grandmother's sister, then her cousin. I begged them to visit her, to see for themselves. Both said the same thing. You're going through a difficult time. Roger is sacrificing so much. 2 days later, Roger assembled another family meeting. My great-aunt and grandmother's cousin sat on the couch, looking at me with pity. Roger spread documents across the coffee table. My failed chemistry test. A note from my counselor about skipping classes. The facility's visitor log showing my unauthorized visits. Trinity has been making wild accusations, Roger said, his voice dripping with false concern, claiming I'm somehow hurting Margaret. Her therapist says this is a grief response. Sweetheart, my great-aunt said, reaching for my hand. We know this is hard, but you need to accept what's happening. Roger is doing everything he can. He's lying, I shouted. She doesn't have dementia. He's doing something to her. Silence. Everyone looked at me like I was losing my mind. 3 days later, Roger changed the locks on grandmother's garden shed. Safety reasons, he said. Valuable items stored before we sell. I was completely alone. No one believed me. Weeks later, I overheard Roger on the phone. Left the extra supply in the garden shed. Grabbing it tomorrow. That night, I broke the shed lock with shaking hands and tore through grandmother's pottery supplies. Hidden under a tarp was a box containing prescription bottles of benzodiazepines, none in grandmother's name, and a journal in Roger's handwriting with dates and dosages. My grandmother wasn't sick. Roger had been systematically drugging her to fake dementia so he could marry her and steal everything. I heard footsteps on gravel. Then Roger stood there with Trevor, eyes on the box. Roger jumped at me and I ran. The box pressed against my chest as I pushed past him through the shed door. Trevor moved to block the back gate, so I turned hard and sprinted around the side of the house. My feet hit the grass and then the driveway and then the sidewalk. My heart beat so loud I could hear it in my ears. Behind me, Roger yelled something, but I didn't stop or look back. I just ran as fast as I could down the street. 3 blocks felt like forever. My lungs burned and my legs hurt, but I kept going. When I finally reached the bus stop, I fell onto the bench. My whole body shook. I held the box tight against me and tried to breathe. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped my change getting on. I sat in the back corner and watched out the window to make sure Roger wasn't following. The bus took me downtown and I got off at the library. It felt safe there. Quiet. Nobody knew me. I found a table in the far corner away from everyone and sat down. My hands still shook as I opened the box again. Roger's journal sat on top with his handwriting all over the pages. Under that were the pill bottles. None of them had grandmother's name on them. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every page of the journal, every bottle, every label, the dates he wrote down, the amounts, all of it. I took picture after picture until I had photographed everything twice just to be sure. Then I opened my email and sent all the photos to myself. Then I sent them again to my school email. Then I created a new email account right there and sent them a third time. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. What if Roger found a way to delete them somehow? What if he got into my accounts? I opened a cloud storage thing I'd never used before and uploaded every single photo. Then I did it again on a different service. Backup after backup after backup. I had to make sure this evidence couldn't disappear. Finally, I checked my phone. 17 missed calls from Roger. 6 text messages. The first one said to come home right now. The second one said I was in serious trouble. The third one used words that scared me. The fourth one said he was calling the police. The fifth one said I stole his private property. The sixth one said he knew where all my friends lived. I blocked his number with shaking fingers. The library felt safe, but I knew I couldn't stay forever. I sat there until the lights started turning off. A librarian walked by and said they were closing in 10 minutes. I packed up the box and walked outside into the dark. I didn't know what to do or where to go. Roger was at the house. I couldn't go back there. Then I remembered Lucille, grandmother's sister. She lived across town. She hadn't believed me before when I called her. She thought I was just upset about grandmother being sick. But maybe if I showed her the actual proof. Maybe if she could see Roger's journal and the pills with her own eyes. Maybe she would believe me this time. I got on another bus heading toward her neighborhood. Then I had to transfer to a second bus. It took almost an hour to get there. By the time I rang her doorbell, it was 8 at night. I still had my backpack with the box inside. Lucille opened the door and her face looked annoyed at first. Like, why was I showing up so late? But then she actually looked at me. Really looked. My face must have shown everything because her expression changed completely. She pulled the door open wider and told me to come inside. Her dining room had a big wooden table. I put my backpack down and pulled out the box. My voice cracked when I started talking. I spread Roger's journal out on the table. Then the pill bottles. I tried to explain what each page meant. The dates matched up with when grandmother started acting confused. The amounts got bigger over time. The pills weren't in her name. They were in names I'd never heard of. Lucille put on her reading glasses and picked up the journal. She didn't say anything. She just read page after page. Then she picked up the bottles and looked at the labels. She went back to the journal and checked the dates again. Her face got paler and paler. She set the journal down carefully and looked at me. Her voice came out quiet and serious. She said she was calling her lawyer friend. Right now. Tonight. She picked up her phone and walked into the kitchen. I heard her talking fast and urgent. She came back a few minutes later and said Clifford was coming over immediately. Clifford Reed showed up in less than an hour. He was older with gray hair and a nice suit even though it was nighttime. Lucille said he'd been grandmother's lawyer for 20 years. He knew her. He knew she'd been healthy and sharp. He sat down at the table and looked at everything I'd laid out. Then he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of every page, every bottle. He asked me questions about when I found the box, what Roger had said during other times, how grandmother acted when I visited her, whether anyone else knew about this. I answered everything as best I could. My voice kept shaking, but I made myself keep talking. This was too important. Clifford took notes on his phone while I talked. He photographed the journal from different angles. He lined up all the pill bottles and took a picture of them together. Then individual pictures of each label. He worked slowly and carefully, like he was building a case, like he believed me. When he finished taking pictures, he looked at Lucille and then at me. His face was serious but not mean. He explained that what Roger did was illegal. Really illegal. The guardianship papers and power of attorney were based on fake medical evidence. That meant they could be challenged in court. But we had to move fast. Roger would try to destroy evidence or move grandmother somewhere we couldn't find her once he realized I had proof. Lucille said I was staying here tonight. No arguments. She wasn't letting me go back to that house where Roger could get to me. She set me up in her guest bedroom with clean sheets and towels. I finally let myself cry. Really cry. All the fear from the past weeks came pouring out. The loneliness of nobody believing me. The terror of Roger's threats. The helplessness of watching grandmother disappear into that fog. But now I wasn't alone anymore. Lucille believed me. Clifford believed me. We had evidence. Real proof that Roger had been lying about everything. The next morning, I woke up in Lucille's guest room with sunlight coming through unfamiliar curtains. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then everything came back and my stomach twisted. Clifford arrived before breakfast with a briefcase full of papers. He spread them across the kitchen table and explained that Roger got his guardianship and power of attorney based on fake medical evidence. That meant we could challenge it in court, but we had to move fast. Roger would try to destroy evidence or move grandmother somewhere we couldn't find her once he realized I had proof. Clifford made 3 phone calls right there at the table. First to family court, filing an emergency motion to suspend Roger's guardianship and give Lucille temporary authority instead. Second to Adult Protective Services, reporting suspected elder abuse and fraud. Third to the state medical board about the doctor who diagnosed grandmother. He talked fast and took notes, and I just sat there watching it happen. Real adults taking real action because they believed me. By noon, Clifford had filed all the paperwork at the courthouse. He came back and said we'd have a hearing within a few days. My phone rang that afternoon. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but Clifford nodded at me. A woman's voice introduced herself as Caroline Sumner from Adult Protective Services. She needed to take my statement about the suspected abuse. Her voice was professional but not cold. She asked specific questions about grandmother's lucid moments. When did they happen? How long did they last? What did grandmother say? She asked about Roger's behavior toward me. The threats. The controlling actions. I answered everything as clearly as I could. Caroline said she was visiting the facility today to interview grandmother and observe her condition. She'd request access to grandmother's current medication records, too. After we hung up, Clifford looked satisfied. Things were moving. That evening, the house phone rang. Lucille answered, and her face went tight. She held the phone away from her ear, and I could hear Roger screaming from across the room. Something about stolen property and calling the police. Clifford took the phone calmly. He said Roger was now under investigation for elder abuse and fraud. Roger should retain legal counsel. Then he hung up. My hands were shaking, but Clifford looked completely calm, like he'd done this 100 times before. The next day, Caroline called again. She'd visited grandmother and noticed she seemed overly sedated. The facility administrator was reviewing grandmother's file. There were problems with her admission paperwork. The diagnosis came from a doctor who wasn't grandmother's regular physician. That doctor had left the state. Caroline's voice had an edge to it now. She said the facility was cooperating fully with the investigation. 2 days later, a different call came. Detective Galen McKenzie introduced himself. He was handling the criminal investigation into Roger's actions. He'd reviewed the evidence Clifford provided and wanted to meet with me. His voice was steady and serious. He said he'd handled elder abuse cases before. He treated me like a real witness instead of a confused teenager. We met at the police station that afternoon. Galen was older with gray hair and tired eyes. He asked me to walk through everything again from the beginning. He took notes and recorded our conversation. He asked about the journal entries and prescription bottles, about Roger's threats, about Trevor's behavior toward me. When I finished, he said they were obtaining a warrant to search Roger's house and the garden shed. The warrant came through the next morning. Galen called to tell me they'd found more journals. Financial documents showing Roger transferring grandmother's money to accounts in his name. Additional prescription medications hidden in the house. Roger had been sloppy once he thought he'd won. 4 days after Clifford filed the emergency motion, we went to family court. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Roger sat at a table with his lawyer looking furious. Trevor wasn't there. The judge was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes. She reviewed the evidence while we waited. Clifford presented Roger's journal first, then the prescription bottles, then Caroline's report from her facility visit. Roger's lawyer argued that I was a troubled teen acting out due to grief, that I'd stolen private property and fabricated evidence. But Clifford had Caroline's observations, the facility administrator's report about the irregular paperwork, the pharmacist's statement about the prescriptions, Detective Galen's preliminary investigation findings. The judge's face got darker as she read through everything. She asked Roger's lawyer to explain the journal entries. The lawyer fumbled, said they were taken out of context. The judge asked what context would make sense of dosage schedules for medications not prescribed to the patient. Silence. Then the judge called me to testify. My legs felt weak walking to the witness stand. I put my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Clifford asked me questions about grandmother's lucid moments. I described how she'd be confused and foggy, then suddenly clear and sharp for a few minutes, asking about school and my college plans. Then the fog would roll back in. I testified about Roger's threatening behavior, the way he cornered me in the kitchen with Trevor blocking the exit, how he'd grabbed my shoulder hard enough to bruise, about finding the evidence in the shed and Roger catching me with it. Roger's lawyer tried to make me seem unreliable, asked about my failed chemistry test, my skipped classes, but I explained that was after Roger started controlling everything, after he opened my mail and threatened my college fund, after weeks of nobody believing me and feeling completely alone. The judge stopped the lawyer's questions. She said she'd heard enough. She immediately suspended Roger's guardianship, granted Lucille temporary authority over grandmother's care and finances. Ordered grandmother transferred to a different facility for proper medical evaluation. Roger's face went dark red. He started to stand up, but his lawyer grabbed his arm. Trevor wasn't there to hold him back this time. The judge warned Roger that criminal charges were pending. He was not to contact grandmother or me. Violation would result in immediate arrest. We left the courthouse and I couldn't stop shaking. Lucille put her arm around me. Clifford looked grimly satisfied. It wasn't over yet, but grandmother was safe now. Roger couldn't hurt her anymore, and people finally believed me. Caroline made calls from the courthouse hallway while Lucille kept her arm around me. Within an hour, she had Margaret's transfer approved and a different facility lined up across town. The new place specialized in medical evaluations, not long-term memory care. Caroline explained that Bernadette would examine Margaret there, run proper tests, and document everything. A police escort would accompany the ambulance to make sure Roger couldn't interfere. The transfer happened that same afternoon. I wanted to go, but Caroline said it was better if I waited. Let the medical team do their work first. Lucille drove me back to her house and I sat on the couch feeling restless and useless. My phone buzzed with texts from the school friends asking where I'd been. I didn't know how to explain any of it. 3 days felt like 3 years. Caroline called with updates. Margaret was resting. The doctors were running tests. She seemed confused but calm. I paced Lucille's living room and couldn't focus on homework or TV or anything. On the 4th day, Caroline called and said I could visit. Lucille drove me to the new facility and my hands shook the entire way. The building looked different from the memory care place. Brighter. More windows. Less like a prison. Caroline met us in the lobby and walked me to Margaret's room. I stopped in the doorway, suddenly terrified. What if she was still foggy? What if Roger had damaged her brain permanently? Then Margaret looked up from her chair by the window and her eyes focused on me immediately. Her voice came out clear and strong when she said my name. Not confused, not hesitant. Just Margaret. I crossed the room and hugged her and she hugged back with real strength. She asked what happened, why she was here, where Roger was. Her words made sense. Her thoughts connected properly. She was really back. I sat in the chair next to hers and held her hand and explained everything. About finding the drugs and journal in the shed. About Roger catching me. About Lucille and Clifford and the emergency hearing. About how Roger had been drugging her for months to fake dementia so he could marry her and steal everything. Margaret started crying halfway through my explanation. Not the confused tears from before. These were angry tears. Horrified tears. She kept saying she remembered fragments. Pieces of the past year that felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Roger's voice telling her to take her vitamins. Papers appearing in front of her that she couldn't focus on. His hand guiding hers to sign things. The fog in her brain that wouldn't lift no matter how hard she tried to think clearly. She remembered our visits when I'd sneak in. How she'd fight through the haze for a few minutes to talk to me. How the clarity would slip away again. And she'd feel herself disappearing. Bernadette came in later that afternoon with Caroline. She explained the blood test results showed high levels of benzodiazepines in Margaret's system. The drugs Roger had been giving her. Bernadette confirmed that Margaret showed no signs of actual dementia. No brain damage, no cognitive decline, just significant drug-induced problems that were clearing now that she wasn't being poisoned anymore. Over the next few days, Margaret got sharper and more alert. The fog lifted completely. She started making jokes with the nurses, asking for real food instead of the bland facility meals, demanding to know when she could go home. She gave a formal statement to Caroline and Bernadette about what she remembered. Roger giving her pills every single day, telling her they were vitamins for her health. How she'd feel cloudy and confused within an hour of taking them. How he'd bring papers for her to sign when she was at her foggiest. His voice always there, guiding her hand, telling her what to do. She remembered signing something about marriage, but it felt like watching someone else's hand move. She remembered Roger talking about selling things but couldn't focus enough to argue. The whole year felt like drowning while everyone watched and did nothing. 5 days after the courthouse hearing, Detective Galen arrested Roger and Trevor. The charges included elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Roger's bail got set high because the judge considered him a flight risk. He'd already proven he'd do anything for money. Trevor faced conspiracy charges for helping intimidate me and blocking my access to Margaret. Galen said more charges might come as they investigated further. Meanwhile, Clifford started the hard work of tracing what Roger had stolen. He found bank transfers moving Margaret's money into accounts Roger controlled. Records of jewelry and artwork sold to dealers and collectors. Some assets were recoverable through insurance or legal action. But Roger had spent a lot already. Gambled some of it away. Used it for expensive purchases he'd hidden. Bought a boat he'd registered under a fake name. Some of Margaret's things were gone forever. Sold to people who'd bought them legally, and couldn't be forced to return them. Clifford estimated we might recover 60% of what Roger took. Maybe less. The memory care facility where Roger had placed Margaret faced serious questions too. Their administrator got called in by the state licensing board to explain how they'd accepted a patient without proper medical documentation. How they'd allowed Roger to restrict visitor access without following standard procedures. How they'd never questioned the diagnosis or requested records from Margaret's actual doctors. The administrator cooperated fully with investigators, turning over every document related to Margaret's admission and care. He claimed Roger had provided paperwork that looked legitimate, that they'd trusted a licensed nurse's word about his wife's condition. But the state board wasn't satisfied with those answers. They launched a formal investigation into the facility's admission practices. Caroline told us other families had started coming forward with concerns about their relatives at that same facility. Roger might not have been the only person taking advantage of loose oversight. Margaret got better every day after that. The first week at the new facility, she still seemed foggy sometimes, confused about where she was or what day it was. But by the second week, the change was obvious. She started making jokes with the nurses, asking them about their families and remembering their names. She complained about the food and demanded real coffee instead of the weak stuff they served. When I visited on day 10, she looked at me with completely clear eyes and asked how my chemistry test went. I almost cried because she sounded exactly like herself again, sharp and interested in everything. By week 2, she was getting frustrated with being stuck in the facility. She kept asking Bernadette when she could go home, saying she felt fine and didn't need to be monitored anymore. Bernadette was careful, though, wanting to make sure all the drugs were completely out of Margaret's system and that her cognitive function stayed stable. She ran more tests and watched Margaret carefully, looking for any signs of relapse or lingering effects. Finally, after 3 weeks of monitoring, Bernadette cleared Margaret for discharge. Lucille and I picked her up on a Tuesday morning. Margaret walked out of that facility on her own, carrying a small bag of belongings, looking stronger than I'd seen her in months. We drove back to her real house, the one Roger had kept her away from. When we pulled into the driveway, Margaret just sat in the car for a minute, staring at her garden. Then she got out and walked straight to her roses, touching the petals gently. She started crying, quiet tears running down her face. Lucille and I stood back and let her have that moment. Margaret turned to us and said she'd been so scared she'd never see her home again. We helped her inside and she walked through every room, touching her furniture and looking at her photos on the walls. Some things were missing, the pieces Roger had sold, but enough remained that it still felt like her space. That first night home, Margaret seemed happy and relieved. But around 3 a.m, I heard her crying out. I ran to her room and found her sitting up in bed, shaking and disoriented. She'd had a nightmare about Roger forcing pills down her throat. I sat with her until she calmed down, making tea and talking about normal things until the sun came up. The nightmares kept happening. Margaret would wake up scared, sometimes not sure if she was really home or back in that facility. During the day, she'd get paranoid about her medications, even the regular vitamins Bernadette prescribed. She'd ask me 3 or 4 times if I was sure they were the right pills, if I'd checked them myself. Bernadette noticed Margaret's struggles during a follow-up visit. She referred Margaret to a therapist who worked specifically with trauma and elder abuse cases. Margaret didn't want to go at first, saying she should be able to handle this herself. But Lucille and I convinced her that what Roger did wasn't something you just got over on your own. I was struggling too, though I tried to hide it at first. I couldn't sleep well, kept waking up at small sounds, convinced Roger had somehow gotten out and was coming back. At the school, I'd jump when people came up behind me unexpectedly. My grades were slipping because I couldn't focus on homework. Lucille noticed and asked me directly if I was okay. I admitted I wasn't. She set up counseling for me too, with someone who worked with teenagers who'd been through family trauma. Talking to the counselor helped. I could explain how scared I'd been when no one believed me, how isolated I felt, how I still sometimes woke up thinking I'd imagined all the evidence and Roger was still in control. About a month after Margaret came home, Clifford called with news about Roger's case. The criminal trial was scheduled for 3 months out, but Roger's lawyer had approached the prosecutor about a plea deal. Roger wanted to avoid trial and was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges. Clifford explained this meant Roger knew the evidence against him was strong and he'd likely lose at trial. Margaret and I sat at her kitchen table talking about whether we should accept a plea deal. She looked tired, older than she had before all this started. She said she was exhausted and wanted this whole thing over with. But she also wanted Roger to face real consequences for what he'd done to her. She didn't want him getting some light sentence and being out in a year. I felt the same way. Part of me wanted to see Roger tried in court, wanted a jury to hear everything he'd done, but another part of me was scared of a trial, of having to testify and be cross-examined by his lawyer. The prosecutor met with us the following week to explain the options. A plea deal would guarantee Roger's conviction, but probably mean lighter sentencing. A trial risked acquittal if something went wrong, but could result in maximum penalties if we won. He said the evidence was strong, but juries were unpredictable. Margaret and I talked about it for days. Finally, we decided we'd accept the plea only if it included significant prison time. We told Clifford to negotiate for the longest sentence possible within the plea framework. 2 weeks later, the deal was finalized. Roger would plead guilty to elder abuse, fraud, and forgery. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning in November. Margaret, Lucille, and I sat in the courtroom watching Roger stand before the judge. He looked smaller somehow, less threatening than he'd seemed in our house. The judge went through each charge, asking Roger if he understood what he was pleading guilty to. Roger said yes in a quiet voice. Then the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison with no possibility of parole before 4 years. Trevor had taken a separate plea deal for conspiracy charges. He got 2 years. I felt something release in my chest when I heard those sentences. 6 years wasn't forever, but it was real time. Roger would be in prison while I finished high school and college. While Clifford worked on the legal side, he was also tracing Margaret's stolen money. He found bank accounts Roger had opened in his name, records of transfers from Margaret's accounts. He identified jewelry and artwork Roger had sold, tracking down buyers and dealers. Some items were recoverable through insurance claims or legal action forcing returns. But Roger had spent a lot already. He'd gambled some away at casinos. He'd bought expensive things and hidden them, including a boat registered under a fake name. Some of Margaret's belongings were gone forever, sold to people who'd bought them legally, and couldn't be forced to give them back. Clifford estimated we'd recover about 60% of what Roger had stolen. Maybe less once all the legal fees were paid. Margaret said she was okay with that. She had enough money left to live comfortably and pay for my college. The money mattered less than getting her life back. Margaret and I developed a new routine at home. We were both healing, but it was slow and not always steady. Some days were good, where we could laugh and talk about normal things. Other days were hard, when the nightmares came back, or Margaret got paranoid about her pills again. We learned to be patient with each other and ourselves. Margaret started helping me with my college applications again, just like she used to before Roger came into our lives. We'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, working through essays and financial aid forms. I helped her go through the house, making lists of what Roger had sold and what could be replaced. Some things were just things, she said. Others, like her mother's ring, hurt to lose. We focused on making the house feel safe again, buying new furniture for the rooms that felt too empty, rearranging things so they didn't remind us of Roger's time there. Lucille started coming over twice a week after that, usually on Tuesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. The first few visits felt awkward because she kept apologizing, saying she should have believed me from the start, that she failed both Margaret and me. I told her it was okay, that Roger had fooled everyone, but she'd shake her head and apologize again. Eventually, I sat her down at the kitchen table and explained that she came through when it really mattered, that she got Clifford involved and helped save Margaret's life. That seemed to help. After that, she relaxed and started acting more like herself, bringing groceries and helping with dinner, telling stories about when Margaret was younger. Margaret loved having her sister around again. They'd sit in the living room for hours talking and laughing, making up for all the time Roger had stolen from them. In March, my college acceptance letters started arriving. I'd check the mailbox every day after school, my stomach tight with nerves. The first few were rejections, which stung, but I'd expected some. Then one Thursday, I opened a thick envelope from my top choice school and just stared at the acceptance letter, reading it 3 times to make sure it was real. Margaret was in the kitchen when I ran inside, and she took one look at my face and started crying happy tears before I even showed her the letter. She grabbed my hands and told me how proud she was, how I'd worked so hard for this. She insisted on throwing a celebration dinner that weekend, calling Lucille, Clifford, and Bernadette to invite them over. Saturday night, our dining room felt full and alive for the first time in over a year. Clifford brought champagne and sparkling cider, toasting to my future. Bernadette gave me a leather journal for college. Lucille made my favorite dessert. Margaret kept getting teary and squeezing my hand, saying this was what Roger had tried to take from me and he'd failed. The next few months passed in a blur of final exams and graduation preparations. June arrived hot and humid, and suddenly I was wearing a cap and gown, lining up with my classmates outside the football field. I spotted Margaret and Lucille in the bleachers, waving and taking pictures. Walking across that stage to get my diploma felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. Everything that happened with Roger felt like a nightmare from another world, but it was also deeply meaningful, knowing Margaret was there watching, healthy and clear-minded, free from Roger's drugs. After the ceremony, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, telling me she loved me and everything was going to be wonderful now. Around that time, Margaret started talking about the scholarship fund. She'd been meeting with Clifford about what to do with some of the recovered money, and she wanted to create something good from what Roger had done. She established a fund for students who'd experienced family trauma, kids dealing with loss or abuse or situations like ours. She said if her suffering could help even one kid get to college who otherwise couldn't, then something good would come from Roger's scheme. She worked with Clifford to set up the legal structure and chose the first recipients that summer. Summer itself became about reclaiming the house. Margaret and I went through every room, making lists of what Roger had sold and what we wanted to replace. Some things were just things, she said, but others mattered. We couldn't get back her mother's ring or the antique desk, but we could make the space feel safe and ours again. We started with my room, painting the walls a light blue I'd always wanted. We bought a new bed frame and desk, arranged everything exactly how I liked it. Then we tackled the living room, replacing the couch Roger had sold with one we picked out together. We bought new curtains and threw out the rug that reminded us of him. Every change made the house feel more like ours and less like a place Roger had contaminated. Bernadette came by once a month to check on Margaret. The physical exams always came back normal. No lasting effects from the drugs Roger had given her. The psychological healing was slower. Margaret was working with a therapist twice a week, processing the betrayal and violation of what Roger had done. Some sessions left her quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the day. Other times she'd come home energized, saying she'd had a breakthrough. Bernadette said the progress was steady and healthy, that Margaret was doing the hard work of healing. Margaret and I both had hard days when the trauma would surface without warning. She'd have nightmares about Roger giving her pills, wake up disoriented and scared. I'd have panic attacks when someone stood too close or raised their voice. We learned to recognize the signs in each other and respond with patience. When Margaret had a bad day, I'd sit with her and remind her where she was, that Roger was in prison and couldn't hurt her anymore. When I struggled, she'd make tea and let me talk or just sit quietly until the fear passed. We were closer now than before Roger, bonded by surviving his scheme together. We understood each other's triggers and fears in a way most people never would. August came too fast. Lucille helped me pack for college, sorting through clothes and supplies, making sure I had everything I needed. Moving day arrived on a Saturday, and both Lucille and Margaret insisted on coming. We loaded my stuff into Lucille's car and made the 2-hour drive to campus. My dorm room was tiny, just enough space for a bed, desk, and dresser. Margaret immediately started arranging things, asking where I wanted my lamp, should the books go on this shelf or that one. She met my roommate, a girl from across the state studying biology, and chatted with her for 20 minutes about classes and campus life. When it was time for them to leave, Margaret hugged me in the parking lot and made me promise to call if I needed anything, anytime, day or night. The first few weeks were rough, adjusting to classes and living away from home, but Margaret video called me every Tuesday and Friday evening, asking about my professors and roommate, telling me about her week. I came home most weekends at first, needing the familiar comfort of the house and Margaret's presence. Gradually, I settled into campus life, making friends and getting involved in activities. We created a new normal that included what happened with Roger but didn't let it define everything. We talked about it when we needed to, acknowledged the trauma, but also focused on moving forward. I was thriving at college in ways I hadn't expected. My classes challenged me, and I loved the independence of managing my own schedule. I'd declared pre-law as my major after talking with an academic advisor. I wanted to help people in situations like ours, families being manipulated or abused, people who needed someone to believe them and fight for them. When I told Margaret during one of our video calls, she got teary again and said Roger had accidentally given me a career calling, that I'd take the worst thing that happened to us and use it to help others. Winter break came and Margaret asked me to sit down at the kitchen table one evening after dinner. She spread out a stack of legal papers in front of me, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She'd been working with Clifford to completely redo her will and estate planning, she explained, pointing to different sections with her finger. She named Lucille and me as co-trustees, which meant we'd both have equal say in managing her affairs if anything ever happened. No single person could take control again. She also established something called a living will that spelled out exactly what medical care she wanted and didn't want, with copies filed at her doctor's office and the hospital. If she ever got sick or couldn't make decisions, doctors would follow her written instructions, not whatever some spouse or guardian claimed she wanted. Margaret made me read through the whole thing, showing me where our names appeared and explaining what each section meant. We both signed the papers with Clifford as witness, and she locked the originals in her safe deposit box at the bank. She seemed lighter after that, like she'd finally taken back the control Roger had stolen. When January ended and it was time to head back for spring semester, I packed my car with Lucille helping carry boxes down from my room. Margaret stood in the driveway watching, her arms crossed against the cold but smiling. She hugged me tight before I got in the car and told me to drive safe and call when I got there. I backed out slowly, watching her wave in the rearview mirror, and something clicked in my head during that 2-hour drive back to campus. Roger had tried to destroy everything, tried to steal Margaret's money and independence and leave me with nothing. But instead, he'd shown us exactly how strong we were when we fought together. Margaret was healthy now, sharp and in control of her life again with legal protections that would keep her safe. I was building the future I wanted, studying to help other people who needed someone to believe them and fight for them. We both knew we could handle whatever came next because we'd already survived the absolute worst thing that could happen and came out on the other side still standing, still fighting,